and something we've been talking about a lot of is turning cost centers into profit centers.
Yes, this is actually a good one. Yeah.
And the idea there is, well, you could reduce something as an expense, and turn that into a production. And the question mark is, are there things in your life that you could just think a little more positively about, instead of figuring out how can I reduce this or remove it out of my life, or then turning that into how could I make production out of that? How could I make that expense an asset?
This is BetterWealth with Caleb Williams. Welcome back to another episode of the BetterWealth podcast. In today's BetterWealth breakdown, we're breaking down ideas, concepts, and thoughts from around the world to help you live a more intentional life. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about the difference between producing versus reducing. And this very much goes into abundance versus scarcity.
That's right. And so the idea is to focus on production instead of reduction. And in business, it's really all around deductions. A lot of people are trying to deduct as many expenses and things like that. And a lot of times people at the end of the year, they end up spending $1 to save 30 cents. Yep. And you have diminishing returns on that. And what's interesting is, like, the top 10 business deductions are also the top 10 things that the IRS audits for the most. Yeah. And so somebody that we know in the tax world keeps hammering this point home of, you guys should be focusing on production instead of reducing your tax liability. Now, I'm not going to say that that's a bad thing, but it's this idea of quit focusing on the thing that has a minimal impact and start focusing on how can you create unlimited impact and production. And even when I was growing up, it goes back to the coupon episode of always looking at reduce. How can we reduce expenses? How can we do this? How can we do that? Instead of what could we do to make more money? What could we do to make more impact? And that's been a big shift for me, is being able to go from that reduction to producer mindset.
Right. And the example that comes to my mind is your mind can only be in abundance or it can be in scarcity. It's very hard to balance both. Although sometimes I think I can, I just really have to check where my mind's at. And so anytime I'm like, especially food, this is food for me, is like, I hate spending money on food. I know the benefits of health, I'm all about that, but spending money on food really, really irks me, and it really, really frustrates me. And I don't know why. I think it's maybe my upbringing, maybe the scarcity mentality that I fall into, but I'm like constantly looking at, like, how can we reduce what we're spending on food, and then instead of saying, like, what piece of content could I create that could 100% pay for that food tenfold? What relationship? What do we need to do in our business? What do you understand where if I'm focused on one thing, it's like my mind's not on abundance. Now, I also am very big on self-awareness, and I think some people need to reduce. Yep. And so it's going back to that clarity piece. And so do you have an idea of, like, how you know when, like, how much time you should spend? Or, like, I know that this is something for me, I'm around positive people, and so I constantly go back and, like, okay, I need to think abundantly, and we track our money, and we have checks and balances, because I'm not just saying, like, oh, just be in abundance and go broke. Yeah. So it's a fine balance.
I think a lot of it is mindset, though. It's like, the produce really has a positive connotation to it, and reduce has a negative connotation to it. And there obviously needs to be a balance there. And something we've been talking about a lot of is turning cost centers into profit centers.
Yes, this is actually a good one. Yeah.
And the idea there is, well, you could reduce something as an expense, and turn that into a production. And the question mark is, are there things in your life that you could just think a little more positively about, instead of figuring out how can I reduce this or remove it out of my life, or then turning that into how could I make production out of that? How could I make that expense an asset? And I think, again, whether it's personally, whether it's professionally or in business, there's a lot of different ways of just changing your mindset, of maybe putting a positive spin on things, and you're going to think about it in a different way and be able to change that from reduction to production, and have a positive impact all the way around.
An example of this is actually twofold. Number one is with our podcast. So we spend money, and we actually do this in-house. So we have an amazing in-house team that does the podcast. And so one of the things is, yes, it's a little bit more expensive, but what we're doing is we're figuring out the process, and we're doing a podcast a day, and now we're producing other people's podcasts, and that same expense is now becoming an asset. So that's not something I wasn't prepared to talk about today, but like what in your life are you spending money that you could potentially have an abundant mindset, have a production mindset to say, what's what I'm spending money on? How could it put money back in my pocket? This is obviously easier if you have more of an entrepreneurial drive, but I think you can still do this in real life. Another example is we do a lot of fun gifts. If I'm going to be meeting with somebody or if I met with somebody and I just want to make them smile or laugh, I might send them a socks with their face on it, or I might send them a video card via the mail. Same thing. There's an expense to that, but we built a business around creating that same service because we figured out the ins and outs on how to offer, personalized socks with a note or how to offer a video card through the mail. And so those are just examples of expenses that I would say those activities are actually helping us. I would say this podcast has helped us greatly, and sending socks in the mail help create a smile. But then on top of that, we're creating the asset even more because we're taking that and creating a playbook, which that's another episode in itself, is how we create playbooks at BetterWealth.
Yeah, and I think to your point, there's unlimited ways that you could find opportunities for this. I actually remember distinctly you asked our neighbor, "Hey, could we use your lawnmower?" And the reason for that is then we don't have to go get our own lawnmower, and it really makes sense, especially with a small lawn like with what we have. Why not just use the neighbor's lawnmower? And there's a lot of opportunities like that. And lo and behold, people aren't willing to ask. A lot of times.
Right. When it comes to money, don't worry, I will ask.
So find ways that you can either produce or reduce in your life, in your business, in your relationships, however it may be, and really go and create a positive impact.
Thank you so much for listening to the BetterWealth podcast. It would mean the world to me if you could hit subscribe, leave a review, and share this with the people that you know and love.